The discovery. The crisp autumn air swept through the small town, carrying with it a blend of dried leaves and distant chimney smoke. Ella pulled her worn, too-small jacket tighter around her as she walked down the cracked sidewalk leading to the town's central park. The park was her only retreat, a sanctuary from the bustle of the overcrowded orphanage and the relentless noise of the children who lived there. It was the one place where she could escape the weight of her responsibilities, her dreams, and her past. At 17, Ella had already faced more than most adults. Her parents had died when she was 8, leaving her to be shuttled between relatives until the foster system eventually dropped her off at St. Mary's Orphanage, the last stop in a string of institutions she'd come to know. At St. Mary's, she kept mostly to herself. She took comfort in drawing, sketching the things she could never afford or reach. Beautiful homes with sprawling gardens, smiling families, and carefree children playing under clear blue skies. Art was her way of keeping dreams alive, of clinging to a sense of beauty in an otherwise gray world. To support herself, she worked part-time at the only grocery store in town, where she spent long hours stocking shelves and helping customers. Each day felt like a slow trudge toward an uncertain future. There were no college funds, no family legacy to inherit, just the faint hope that somehow, someday, things would get better. Art was her only hope, but it seemed like a distant, unreachable dream. As she walked the path toward her favorite bench in the park, she found herself lost in thought, picturing a life far removed from the orphanage. Her hand clutched a small notebook she used to jot down sketches of anything that caught her eye. She looked forward to adding to it today, hoping to capture the last of the autumn colors before winter's gray arrived. Just as she neared the old wooden bench, something caught her eye, a bright glint that sparkled beneath the bench. Ella froze, narrowing her eyes. The shimmer was unmistakable, but it didn't belong to any leaf or pebble she'd ever seen. Curiosity piqued. She knelt down, pushing aside the fallen leaves and reaching her hand under the bench. Her fingers grazed something cold and metallic. She pulled it out slowly, her eyes widening as she held it up to the light. A diamond ring sat in her palm, pristine and dazzling, despite its inconspicuous resting place. The diamond was larger than any she'd ever seen, set in what appeared to be white gold. Delicate filigree lined the band, scrolling in intricate patterns that glimmered in the afternoon sun. She turned it over, heart pounding, and noticed something etched on the inside. A pair of initials engraved in delicate script. C.W. Ella's mind raced. This ring had to be worth a fortune, far more than anything she'd ever held in her life. She felt her pulse quicken as thoughts flooded her mind. She imagined what the money could buy: an escape from the orphanage, a small apartment, art classes, clothes that fit, a life where she could begin anew. But almost as quickly, her excitement dimmed. She remembered Mrs. Harper, one of the orphanage's older house mothers, who had lost her wedding ring a year ago. Mrs. Harper had wept for weeks, not because of its monetary value, but because it was her last tie to her late husband. Ella knew that for many, rings like these weren't just accessories. They were irreplaceable, priceless treasures. A battle of wills surged within her, the allure of a brighter future clashing with her sense of right and wrong. Her grip tightened around the ring as she gazed out at the park, feeling the familiar sting of disappointment in her throat. She couldn't keep it, not knowing that someone out there might be heartbroken over its loss. No, she would have to return it. Ella sighed, brushing off her knees as she rose from the bench, slipping the ring into the pocket of her jacket. She knew where to start. Bernard's fine jewelry was the only place in town with the resources to trace the ring's owner. Mr. Bernard, the store owner, had always been kind to her, offering a smile and gentle encouragement whenever she passed by his shop. She would go to him first thing in the morning. As Ella walked back to the orphanage, her heart felt heavy, though her conscience lighter. The cold evening air bit at her cheeks, and she wrapped her arms tightly around herself, feeling the weight of the ring in her pocket. But in a strange way, she felt a spark of hope, too, a small sense that this decision, however hard, was the right one. The next morning, Ella dressed as neatly as she could, though her clothes were faded and worn. She made her way to Main Street, her mind still buzzing with questions. The downtown area was already bustling with shoppers, many of whom paid her no mind as they hurried along with their bags and coffee cups. Bernard's fine jewelry stood on the corner, its grand window displays glittering with gold and gemstones. Ella took a deep breath before stepping inside. A soft chime announced her entrance, and she was greeted by Mr. Bernard himself, a warm smile spreading across his face as he recognized her. "Good morning, Ella. What brings you in today?" he asked, his voice friendly but genuinely curious. After all, she'd never been able to afford anything in the store. Ella fumbled nervously, reaching into her pocket and pulling out the ring. She held it out, her voice quiet yet determined. "I found this in the park yesterday, and I thought maybe you'd know who it belongs to." Mr. Bernard's eyes widened slightly as he took the ring, inspecting it closely. He pulled a jeweler's loop from his pocket and examined it further, nodding with approval. "This is an exquisite piece, Ella, and returning it shows a rare kind of honesty." He lowered the ring and looked at her with a newfound respect. "Not many would have done what you did. The initials engraved here, C.W., belong to Mrs. Clara Winchester. She's been a loyal customer of ours for years. This ring must be very dear to her." Ella felt a swell of pride at Mr. Bernard's words, though she quickly tried to hide it. "Do you know where I could find her?" He nodded, pulling a small notepad from behind the counter and scribbling an address on it. "Here. She lives in the Maple Grove area, number 247 on Maple Street. It's a large white house with blue shutters. She'll be thrilled to see this again." She took the slip of paper from him, carefully folding it and tucking it into her jacket. "Thank you, Mr. Bernard," she said softly, feeling her cheeks flush at his praise. "You're doing a wonderful thing, Ella. Not everyone would make the choice you've made," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Good luck." Ella nodded, her heart fluttering as she stepped outside. The day felt brighter, as if even the sun had risen a little higher to cheer her on. She looked at the address, then down the street that led toward Maple Grove. Though the wealthier part of town was foreign to her, she was determined to make the journey. As she walked, Ella couldn't help but wonder about the woman who owned the ring. Who was Clara Winchester? Why would she be so careless as to lose something so valuable? And would she even care that Ella had taken the trouble to return it? As she neared the tall iron gates of 247 Maple Street, Ella's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The house was grander than she had imagined, with pristine white walls and a row of flowering trees lining the walkway. She hesitated at the gate, her worn sneakers feeling out of place on the well-manicured path. But she took a deep breath and walked forward, her fingers brushing the ring in her pocket as she reached the large brass doorbell. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing a woman in a crisp, neatly pressed uniform. Her face was kind, with a hint of curiosity as she looked down at Ella. "May I help you, miss?" Ella straightened, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to see Mrs. Winchester. I found something of hers." The housekeeper's face softened as she stepped aside, gesturing for Ella to enter the grand foyer. The inside of the house was a world away from the worn rooms of Street Mary's orphanage. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead, and a grand staircase curved elegantly toward the upper floors. Ella felt small and out of place, but she stood tall, clutching the ring as her only anchor. "Martha, who's at the door?" came a melodic voice from an adjoining room. "A young lady, Mrs. Winchester. She says she's found something of yours," the housekeeper replied. A tall woman appeared, her hair streaked with silver and her posture graceful yet imposing. She wore a simple yet elegant dress, her eyes filled with curiosity as they settled on Ella. Ella swallowed, nerves creeping up her spine. She held out the ring, her voice barely above a whisper. I found this in the park yesterday. I thought it might be yours." Mrs. Winchester's face lit up as she took the ring from Ella, slipping it onto her finger with a sigh of relief. Oh, thank goodness. I'd feared it was lost forever. She looked back at Ella, her expression warm. Thank you, my dear. That was incredibly honest of you. Not everyone would have returned something so valuable. Ella shook her head. It didn't belong to me. I thought you might miss it. Clara's gaze softened as she observed the young girl standing before her in her threadbare coat and worn shoes, eyes bright with honesty. How about a cup of tea before you go? I'd love to hear more about you. Ella hesitated, but Clara's kindness felt genuine, and she nodded. Perhaps this encounter held more than she bargained for, and as they settled into the sitting room, Clara Winchester knew this was no ordinary girl, and that perhaps this encounter was the beginning of something much more significant than a lost ring. The encounter. Ella sat on the edge of a plush armchair in the elegant sitting room, feeling the weight of her surroundings. The room was unlike anything she'd ever seen, with its high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and shelves of leather-bound books. The air was warm, faintly scented with lavender, and the sunlight streaming through the large windows bathed the room in a soft glow. She clutched her hands together, unsure of where to place them in such an elegant setting, feeling every wrinkle in her coat and scuff on her shoes. Mrs. Clara Winchester sat across from her, her posture relaxed, but her gaze sharp and observant. She was a striking woman, well into her 60s, but with a timeless elegance about her. Her hair was swept back, streaked with silver, and her face bore the subtle lines of experience rather than age. Clara wore a dress that was simple yet undoubtedly expensive, the kind of understated style that spoke of quiet wealth. Despite her reserved demeanor, there was a warmth in her eyes as she studied Ella. "Thank you, Martha," Clara said as the housekeeper, who'd introduced herself with a gentle smile, brought in a silver tea tray. Martha placed the tray between them, and with a final nod, left the room. Clara poured tea into delicate china cups painted with blue and gold flowers, passing one to Ella with an easy grace. "It's not every day I receive such honesty," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "You could have kept the ring and sold it, or perhaps pawned it for a fair sum. May I ask what made you bring it back to me?" Ella shifted, looking down at her cup, her fingers tracing its delicate rim. "I suppose I know how it feels to lose something precious." She took a breath, summoning the courage to explain. "My parents passed away when I was little, and everything I have of them, every little thing, is all I've got left. I know if I lost anything else, I'd be heartbroken." Clara's expression softened, her fingers lingering over her own ring as if for comfort. "I see," she said thoughtfully, a small frown forming as she listened. "That's quite a lot for a young girl to carry. You're from Street Mary's, yes?" "Yes, ma'am," Ella replied, her tone careful. Street Mary's wasn't a place most people liked to discuss. It was run down, overpopulated, and only stayed open through a series of grants and the kindness of the town's charity drives. For most, Street Mary's was a symbol of failure, a place to sweep away the forgotten and the lost. I'd lived there since I was 8. Clara took a sip of her tea, her gaze never leaving Ella's face. "Tell me, Ella, if you don't mind me asking, do you have any plans for the future?" Ella's cheeks flushed, and she set her teacup down to avoid spilling it. I'd like to study art, maybe become an artist or even a teacher someday. I've always loved to draw. But, well," she hesitated, "art isn't exactly a practical career, and I don't have the money to go to college or even take lessons." Clara's eyes brightened, and she leaned forward, her voice gentle. "Art, you say? How wonderful. Do you have any of your sketches with you?" Caught off guard, Ella fumbled with her satchel, retrieving her worn notebook, filled with doodles, sketches, and half-finished portraits. The pages were well thumbed, each one crinkled with use, bearing not only pencil marks, but also traces of the days she'd worked on them, the faint fingerprints of ink, smudges from a hurriedly erased line, and even the occasional coffee stain. Clara took the notebook from Ella's hands as if it were a treasure. She flipped through the pages slowly, her expression a mixture of admiration and intrigue. "You're very talented, Ella. These portraits—" She paused, her fingers brushing over a page depicting a young girl's face caught mid-laughter. "You've captured something real, something vivid." Ella looked away, shy under the praise. "It's just practice," she mumbled, barely able to meet Clara's eyes. "I like drawing people, their expressions. It's like you get to know them, even if it's only on paper." Clara set the notebook down, folding her hands thoughtfully. "Ella, what if you could study art, perhaps even go to a real art school? I know of programs that help young artists like you develop their skills." A mix of hope and fear flickered across Ella's face. She shook her head slightly, her voice wary. "That sounds incredible, Mrs. Winchester, but I've learned not to count on things like that. The foster system doesn't really help people my age. It's a nice dream, though." Clara tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with a sudden determination. "I understand, Ella, but sometimes we all need a bit of help. Would you allow me to assist you? I'd be honored if you'd accept my support. Lessons, supplies, whatever you need." Ella's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her heart hammered as she processed Clara's words, and she searched the woman's face for signs of insincerity, yet found none. Clara's offer felt genuine, not out of pity, but from a place of real admiration. I don't know what to say," Ella whispered, feeling a swell of emotion she hadn't anticipated. "Are you sure?" Clara's smile was soft, her voice resolute. "Very sure. I see something rare in you, Ella. I'd like to help you become the artist you're meant to be." Ella blinked rapidly, a warmth filling her chest. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "No one's ever believed in me like that before." Clara reached out, placing a hand gently over Ella's. "We all need someone who believes in us. Now, how about we start with a little tour of the house? There's an art studio I seldom use anymore, and it could make a perfect place for you to work on your art." Ella's eyes widened in disbelief. She followed Clara through the sprawling rooms, each one more breathtaking than the last. They passed a grand library lined with towering bookshelves, a cozy reading nook by a wide bay window, and a sunlit conservatory filled with lush, green plants. Finally, they arrived at a room tucked away at the end of the hall. A spacious studio with large windows, easels, and a wall lined with canvases and art supplies. Sunlight poured in, illuminating the space in a soft, golden glow. This is incredible," Ella whispered, stepping into the studio as if it were a sacred place. She ran her fingers over the brushes, tracing their wooden handles and the bristles, each brush waiting to bring color to a blank canvas. Clara watched her quietly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You're welcome to come here whenever you like. This room, and everything in it, is yours to use." Ella looked up, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Winchester. I don't know how to repay you." Clara waved her hand dismissively, chuckling softly. "Please, call me Clara. And you've already repaid me, Ella, simply by being yourself. It's not often one meets someone so selfless, someone willing to do what's right despite the temptation to do otherwise." Ella's cheeks flushed with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She looked around the studio, her heart swelling with a mixture of disbelief and hope. For the first time, she began to wonder if her dreams might be within reach after all. Over the next few weeks, Clara and Ella developed an unlikely routine. Ella would visit the estate on her days off from work, spending hours in the studio, drawing, painting, and experimenting with different techniques. Clara would often join her, offering gentle guidance and encouragement, and sometimes sharing stories from her own life, about her late husband, her own dreams, and her regrets. Each shared memory deepened the bond between them. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden with their tea, Ella finally mustered the courage to ask, "Clara, do you ever feel alone? I mean, living in such a big house by yourself." Clara's smile faded slightly, her gaze turning distant. Yes, Ella, I do, especially since my husband passed away. This house used to be full of laughter, parties, dinners with friends, but those days feel like a lifetime ago now. She looked down at her hands, her eyes lingering on the ring Ella had returned. That's why meeting you has been a blessing. You remind me that there's still so much life to live, so much left to give. Ella watched her, a pang of empathy blooming in her chest. She knew loneliness well, knew the ache of missing people who were gone forever. I'm glad we met too, she said softly, surprising herself with the words. You've made me feel like I matter, like my dreams matter. Clara reached across the table, squeezing Ella's hand. Because they do. Ella, you have a gift and a heart full of goodness. Don't ever let go of that. As the weeks passed, Ella began to feel as if Clara's home was a second home for her. She would sketch for hours in the studio, Clara occasionally popping in to see her work. They shared meals, laughed at each other's stories, and found a sense of family neither of them had expected. One rainy afternoon, as they were sitting by the fire in the library, Clara turned to Ella, her face thoughtful. Ella, I've been thinking, what if you stayed here with me? Street Mary's doesn't offer you the stability you need, and this house is far too quiet. You could finish school, take art classes, and have a safe place to call home. The offer was so unexpected that Ella could hardly process it. Her mind raced with thoughts of leaving the orphanage, of having a real home, a steady place where she could grow, dream, and simply be. She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but forced herself to stay calm. I don't know what to say, Ella murmured, her voice thick with emotion. I've never had a choice like this before. Clara's smile was warm, her eyes full of encouragement. Then perhaps it's time you had one, my dear. I don't want to pressure you, of course. Take all the time you need to think it over. Ella nodded, though her heart was already leaning toward saying yes. She couldn't help but wonder if fate had brought her to this moment. The little girl who once thought she'd be alone forever was now being offered a home, a chance to make her dreams come true. It felt surreal, almost like stepping into one of her drawings. As she left that evening, Clara walked her to the door, wrapping her in a gentle embrace. Ella leaned into it, feeling a sense of warmth and belonging she hadn't felt in years. She knew that if she accepted Clara's offer, her life would change forever. And for the first time, Ella felt a glimmer of hope, not just for her art, but for a future filled with love, family, and purpose. As she walked back to the orphanage that night, Ella looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of her past lifting, making room for something new. For once, she dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story was only beginning. A growing bond. Ella awoke the next morning with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. After spending much of the night tossing and turning, she had made her decision. Clara's offer felt like a lifeline, a path that could lead her away from the harshness of her orphaned existence and into a life where her dreams might finally be within reach. She would move into Clara's house, accept her support, and give herself the chance to grow into the artist she wanted to become. She spent the next few days packing her few belongings at the orphanage, her heart a mix of anticipation and bittersweet memories. Street Mary's had been her refuge for many years, a place that sheltered her through her darkest times, but she knew it was time to leave it behind. Her friends at the orphanage hugged her tightly, their excitement for her barely veiling the sadness in their eyes. And as she walked out of Street Mary's for the last time, she made herself a promise that she would never forget the people she was leaving behind. When Ella arrived at Clara's grand home, she was greeted with open arms. Clara, her face alight with happiness, welcomed her into the house as though she'd always belonged there. It wasn't long before Ella settled into the rhythm of her new life. She began each morning in the art studio, the sunlight streaming in through the large windows, filling the room with a golden glow as she sketched and painted. Her afternoons were filled with lessons from a private art tutor Clara had hired, a woman named Miss Bennett, who had once worked with young artists at a prestigious school. Miss Bennet was strict yet encouraging, teaching Ella to view her art with a new level of precision and patience. Ella found herself flourishing under Miss Bennet's guidance, her confidence growing with each brushstroke and every pencil line. Clara would often stop by the studio, watching Ella work with a proud smile, sometimes bringing her tea or snacks, and in the evenings they would sit together in the cozy library, sharing stories and laughter. Clara would listen attentively as Ella spoke of her dreams and fears, encouraging her to embrace each new challenge. Despite the warmth and love that surrounded her, however, Ella couldn't shake a lingering curiosity about Clara's past. The house was filled with reminders of her life before Ella, a life shared with her late husband, whose absence was felt in the quiet spaces of the grand home. One evening, as they sat in the library, Ella gathered the courage to ask a question that had been on her mind since she'd arrived. "Clara, do you ever miss him, your husband?" Ella's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Clara's eyes softened, and she looked away, as if searching for the right words. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Richard was a complicated man, but he was also kind and loving, in his way. He was very protective of me." Clara paused, her gaze distant as memories surfaced. "We had our share of struggles, but life has a way of carrying on, even after the people you love are gone. The house has been so quiet since he passed, until you came along." Ella felt a pang of sympathy, realizing that Clara's life, though marked by wealth and privilege, had not been without its share of heartache. "I'm sorry, Clara. I didn't mean to bring up painful memories." Clara shook her head, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's all right, dear. Painful memories have a way of losing their sting over time." She hesitated, then added softly, "I'm just grateful that you're here. You've brought a light into this house that I thought was gone forever." Ella's cheeks flushed, and she reached across the small table between them, giving Clara's hand a gentle squeeze. "Thank you for letting me be part of your life, Clara. I feel like I finally have a family again." They fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But that night, as Ella lay in bed, she found herself unable to shake a strange feeling. Clara's memories of her husband, while touching, felt guarded, as if there were parts of her past she had intentionally left out. And Ella couldn't ignore the subtle sense that there was more to Clara's story, a hidden layer she couldn't quite reach. Weeks passed, and Ella found herself thriving. Her artwork became more intricate, her confidence blossomed, and her relationship with Clara grew deeper by the day. They spent hours together, cooking meals in the large kitchen, tending to Clara's beloved rose garden, and going on small outings to nearby art galleries and libraries. Each outing felt like a gift, a glimpse into a life Ella had always longed for. One Saturday afternoon, Clara surprised Ella with tickets to an art exhibit at a prestigious gallery downtown. The event was an eye-opener for Ella. She marveled at the masterpieces, taking in the vibrant colors and bold strokes of artists who had captured emotion she could feel, even without knowing their stories. She dreamed of seeing her own work displayed in such a place someday. After the exhibit, they wandered through the city streets, stopping at a small cafe for tea. As they sat at an outdoor table, Ella felt a burst of courage. She decided to open up about the accident that had taken her parents from her, a part of her past she had never shared in detail with anyone. "Clara, there's something I haven't told you," she began, her voice unsteady. Clara's expression shifted, her gaze growing concerned. "You can tell me anything, Ella." Ella took a deep breath, steadying herself. "When I was 8, my parents and I were in a car accident. It was late at night, and we were on our way home from my dance recital." She paused, her hands trembling slightly as she continued. "Another car came out of nowhere. I remember my dad trying to swerve, but they hit us anyway. I was trapped in the back seat, and my parents were hurt badly." Clara's face grew pale, but she listened in silence, her hand reaching across the table to cover Ella's trembling fingers. The people in the other car, they got out, looked at us, and just left. Ella continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I remember the man's face. He looked right at me. I begged him to help, but he just turned and walked away. Clara's hand tightened around Ella's, her expression unreadable. That must have been terrible for you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. No child should have to experience that kind of loss. Ella nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. It was. I felt so abandoned. I lost everything that night. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Ella's story hanging heavily between them. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. I can't begin to imagine the pain you've been through, Ella. But please know, you're not alone anymore. I'm here for you. I'll always be here for you. Ella nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. She had kept this story buried for so long, unwilling to let anyone in on her darkest memory. But now, sharing it with Clara, she felt a strange sense of relief, as if a burden had been lifted. As their lives intertwined further, Ella's past seemed to meld with her future. She began to find solace in the love and care Clara showered upon her, and Clara, in turn, found a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Together, they seemed to fill the empty spaces in each other's lives. But beneath the surface, Clara struggled with a growing sense of guilt. Ella's story had hit her harder than she'd let on, for it had rekindled memories she had long buried. Memories of a rainy night, many years before, when she and her husband had been in a car accident. The details were hazy, clouded by time, and the shock of that evening, but she remembered her husband's urgent voice, his insistence that they leave the scene quickly. "We'll call for help once we get home," he had promised, his hand trembling as he helped her into the car. But they never made that call. The memory haunted her now, sharper and more vivid with each passing day. Could it be possible that Ella's parents had been the victims that night? Had her husband made the choice to abandon them, believing that their own safety mattered more? Clara shuddered at the thought, her heart heavy with the guilt that had lain dormant for years. She knew she needed to find out the truth, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of her past. But how could she tell Ella? How could she risk shattering the fragile bond they had built? One evening, Clara found herself alone in her study, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and documents. She had retrieved every clipping she could find from that year, hoping for some clue, some confirmation of what she dreaded might be true. As she read through the faded headlines, her heart sank. A small article, buried in the local section, confirmed it. Local couple dies in hit-and-run accident. The date and location aligned too perfectly with her memory. Her husband, Richard, had indeed been responsible for the accident that had taken Ella's family, and she, Clara, had unknowingly become a part of Ella's tragedy. A chill ran through her as the weight of the truth settled upon her. She knew that if she kept this secret, it would taint every moment they shared. But telling Ella would risk everything. She would lose the only family she had left, the girl who had brought light back into her life. Clara sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands, as tears streamed down her cheeks. How could she undo a past that had been buried so deeply, one that had already stolen so much from Ella? The next morning, Clara resolved to talk to Ella. She found her in the studio, lost in her sketches, unaware of the storm brewing within Clara's heart. Clara approached her slowly, her voice wavering as she called her name. "Ella, there's something I need to tell you." Ella looked up, concern flashing in her eyes. "What's wrong, Clara?" Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself as she prepared to reveal the truth, a truth that might shatter everything between them. The revelation. Clara sat across from Ella in the bright art studio, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt a tension building within her, each beat of her heart drumming louder as she prepared to speak. Ella, who had been sketching, looked up, sensing Clara's unusual unease. "Clara, is everything all right?" Ella's voice was soft, but her eyes held a flicker of worry. Clara's throat felt tight, as if the truth she needed to speak was lodged somewhere too deep to reach. But she knew she couldn't keep it buried any longer. She took a shaky breath, feeling the weight of years of guilt and secrecy bearing down on her. "Ella," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Ella set her pencil down, her brow furrowing as she shifted to face Clara fully. "You're scaring me, Clara." "What is it?" Clara's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to find the words. Her voice cracked, each syllable a painful admission. "The accident, the one that took your parents. I think my husband was involved." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. Ella's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, her face paling as Clara's confession sank in. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her hands clenched in her lap, and her body grew still, as though bracing herself for a blow. "Your husband? Involved?" Ella's voice was barely audible, the words coming out strained, as if she couldn't quite believe them. Clara's gaze dropped, shame pooling in her chest. She couldn't bear to look Ella in the eye. "I wasn't conscious through most of it," she whispered. "I had been injured, and he insisted that we had to get to the hospital. He said we'd call for help as soon as we got there. But we never made that call." The color drained from Ella's face, her eyes widening as the truth took hold. You knew." Her voice cracked, trembling with a mixture of betrayal and fury. "All this time, you knew." Clara's hands shook as she reached out, desperate to make her understand. "I only just confirmed it," she whispered, her words trembling. "I knew there was an accident, but I never realized. Until you shared your story with me. I didn't know it was your family, Ella. I didn't want to believe it." Ella's face contorted in disbelief and anger. "So you took me in out of guilt. All those promises of helping me, of being there for me. Was it all just because you wanted to feel better about what he did?" Clara's heart shattered at the accusation. She wanted to deny it, to explain that her love for Ella was genuine. But Ella's pain was so raw, her betrayal so deep, that no words felt enough. "Ella," Clara whispered, reaching for her hand. "I didn't take you in because of guilt. I took you in because I saw so much beauty and strength in you. I admired your courage, your honesty. I wanted to help you, to support you, because I love you." But Ella pulled her hand away, her voice rising with hurt and rage. "You love me. You loved me after you left my parents to die. After you sat here every day, pretending to care, while hiding this horror from me." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I know it sounds unforgivable, Ella, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid of losing you." Ella's voice grew colder, her gaze steely as she stared at Clara. "You should have told me the truth the day we met. I thought I'd finally found someone I could trust. But you lied to me, Clara." Clara's heart broke at the coldness in Ella's voice. "Please, Ella," she begged, her voice choked with sorrow. "I know I failed you. I can't change the past. But I want to make things right, to be here for you, if you'll let me." But Ella shook her head, her eyes filled with a pain so deep, it seemed to cut right through her. "There's nothing you can do, Clara. I don't want your apologies. I don't want anything from you." With that, she rose from her seat, grabbing her sketchbook and clutching it tightly to her chest, as though it could shield her from the betrayal she felt. "Ella, please," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't leave like this. Let's talk." But Ella was already gone, storming out of the studio and slamming the door behind her. The sound reverberated through the house, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Clara sank to her knees, her body racked with sobs as she realized she had lost the only family she had left. Ella wandered through the streets, her mind spinning as she replayed Clara's confession. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she had ever felt. Clara had become a mother figure to her, the one person who had shown her a glimpse of the love and family she'd lost. But now, that love felt twisted, tainted by lies and guilt. The kindness, the support, the encouragement, it all felt like an illusion, a thin veneer covering the horrible truth. She found herself at the edge of town, sitting on a worn bench overlooking the river, clutching her sketchbook tightly. The memories of her parents washed over her, their laughter, their warmth, the way they'd hugged her tight after each dance recital. Her father's last words echoed in her mind, the desperate plea he had uttered to the strangers who had left them to die. For years, she had wondered about those people, had dreamt of tracking them down, demanding justice. And now, to realize that the woman who had taken her in, who had become her lifeline, was tied to that tragedy. It was a cruel twist of fate she couldn't bear to face. Clara spent the night in restless agony, unable to sleep, replaying every moment she had shared with Ella. She thought of the countless hours they'd spent together, the joy of watching Ella's talent blossom, the pride she felt in every piece of art Ella had created. But now, all of it felt hollow, marred by her own failure to be honest. The next morning, she could barely bring herself to face the day. The house felt empty, cold, the absence of Ella's laughter and presence, leaving a void that seemed to echo in every room. Clara knew she couldn't undo the damage she'd caused, but she couldn't let things end this way. Driven by a desperate need to make things right, she called her driver and asked him to take her to Street Mary's. She would find Ella and beg for forgiveness, even if it meant facing the full weight of Ella's anger and pain. Ella was back at the orphanage, sitting alone in her small room, her sketchbook open but untouched. The other children, sensing her mood, kept their distance. The familiar walls that had once felt stifling now felt like a refuge, a place where she could retreat from the storm of emotions churning inside her. When the matron came to her room, announcing that she had a visitor, Ella's first instinct was to refuse. But a part of her, a small, fragile part that still clung to the hope that things could be made right, compelled her to go downstairs. She found Clara waiting in the small common room, her face etched with sorrow and guilt. Ella felt a pang of anger, but also a hollow ache, seeing the woman who had once brought so much comfort now looking so broken. "Ella," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I came here to tell you that everything I've done for you, every moment we shared, it was real." Ella's eyes narrowed, her voice cold. "Real. Real like the lie you lived every day. Real like hiding the truth about my parents." Clara winced, her shoulders slumping under the weight of Ella's words. "I know I failed you, Ella. I was selfish, afraid of losing you. But you have to believe me when I say that I love you." Ella looked away, her voice bitter. "Love? How can I believe that when you couldn't even be honest with me?" Clara's hands shook as she took a step forward, her eyes pleading. "I can't undo the past, Ella. But please, give me a chance to make things right. I want to be here for you, in any way you'll let me." Ella shook her head, her heart aching. "I don't know if I can trust you, Clara. I don't even know if I want to." They stood in silence, the weight of Clara's plea heavy in the air. Ella's mind swirled with memories. The warmth of Clara's home, the pride in her eyes as she watched Ella draw, the gentle words of encouragement that had once meant so much. But now, each memory felt tainted, a reminder of the betrayal that had shattered her trust. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand, Ella. I won't ask for anything more. But please, know that I'll be here, if you ever want to talk, or if you need anything." With that, she turned and left, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Ella watched her go, her heart a conflicted mess of anger, sorrow, and a small, stubborn seed of hope that refused to die. For the next few weeks, Ella withdrew into herself. She attended her art classes and focused on her studies, but a part of her felt hollow. She tried to push thoughts of Clara aside, but they lingered, creeping into her mind during quiet moments. One afternoon, As she sat by the river, sketching absent-mindedly, she found herself drawing Clara's face, etched with sadness, yet filled with love. The memory of Clara's words echoed in her mind. Everything we shared was real. She remembered the way Clara had encouraged her, the small acts of kindness that had given her a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. Despite the betrayal, despite the pain, a part of her still longed for that connection, for the sense of family they had begun to build. Ella stared at her sketch, feeling a mix of anger and longing. She knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily, if at all. But perhaps she could find a way to reconcile, to confront the truth and move forward without losing the family she had found. Taking a deep breath, Ella made a decision. She would go to Clara, not to forget the past, but to find a way to live with it. The return. Ella felt a surge of nervous energy as she made her way back to Clara's grand estate. The familiar gate loomed ahead, its wrought iron curves gleaming in the early morning light. She hesitated, clutching her worn satchel with trembling hands. Though it had been weeks since she'd left, the emotions were as raw as ever. Anger, grief, confusion, and an unexpected yearning for the sense of belonging Clara's home had given her. With a deep breath, she pushed open the gate and walked up the stone path, her heart pounding louder with each step. She could still picture Clara's tear-streaked face, could still hear her trembling voice admitting to a secret that had turned Ella's world upside down. Part of her wanted to run, to turn back, and shield herself from reopening those wounds. But she forced herself to keep walking, knowing that without confronting Clara, she'd never be able to move forward. As she reached the doorstep, Ella raised her hand to knock but paused, her fingers hovering in midair. A swell of memories flashed through her mind. The quiet evenings spent sketching in the garden, Clara's encouraging words as she praised each piece of art, the warmth of shared laughter over cups of tea. It was the life she'd always dreamed of, a place she'd come to think of as home. The door swung open before she could knock, and there stood Clara, her face a mixture of surprise, relief, and uncertainty. She wore a simple dress, her silver-streaked hair pulled back, and her expression softened as her gaze settled on Ella. "Ella," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She looked as if she wanted to embrace her but held back, sensing Ella's lingering hesitation. "Clara," Ella said, her voice just as soft. She felt a lump rise in her throat as she struggled to find the words. "I came because I can't just leave things like they are. I can't carry this anger forever." Clara nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "Thank you, Ella," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please come in. We can talk in the garden. It might feel easier there." Ella followed her through the grand foyer, feeling the familiar warmth of the house around her. They walked in silence to the back garden, where a small table was set under the blooming roses. Clara poured tea for them both, her hands shaking slightly as she set the cup in front of Ella. The scent of roses filled the air, mingling with the faint bitterness of the tea, and Ella found herself calming, though her heart still ached with unspoken questions. Clara broke the silence first, her voice a fragile whisper. "Ella, I know I've hurt you deeply. When I learned the truth about that night, it shattered me. I wanted to tell you, but I was terrified of losing you. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to know that everything we shared, all of my care for you, it was real." Ella looked down at her hands, feeling a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I want to believe that," she said quietly, "but it's hard. I thought you were my family, Clara. And then, to find out you were tied to the night my family was taken from me, it feels like a betrayal." Clara's face crumpled, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. "You have every right to feel that way, Ella. I won't try to change how you feel. But please know that the night I lost you felt like losing a piece of myself. I have tried to find ways to make it up to you, to give you the life and love you deserved all along." Ella's gaze softened slightly as she watched Clara struggle with her emotions. Part of her still felt the sting of betrayal, But she also saw the deep regret in Clara's eyes, the vulnerability of a woman who had made mistakes but was now desperately trying to make amends. "I know you want to help me," Ella said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "And I know you regret what happened. But I need time, Clara. I need to be able to trust you again, to see that you really do care." Clara nodded, a hint of relief softening her expression. "Take all the time you need, Ella. I'll be here, whenever you're ready. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope to earn your trust again." Ella sipped her tea, feeling the warmth seep into her. The garden was quiet, the only sounds the distant chirping of birds and the soft rustling of leaves. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to ask the question that had been haunting her since Clara's confession. Did you ever talk to him about it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara's face paled, and she looked down at her hands, her expression filled with a sorrow Ella hadn't seen before. "Yes," she whispered. "After that night, I confronted him. He admitted everything, told me he had panicked, that he had put our safety above everything else. I was horrified, but I was also ashamed. I was part of his choice, even if I was unconscious for most of it." She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she spoke. "We never spoke of it again. He kept saying that we had to move on, that it was too late to make things right. I buried it deep, thinking that was the only way to cope. But when I met you, I realized I couldn't live with that silence any longer. I thought if I could help you, support you, it might atone for some of what he did." Ella listened, feeling a mixture of pity and resentment. She understood Clara's guilt, her desire to make amends, but it didn't erase the years of pain and loneliness Ella had endured. Still, a small part of her softened, seeing the regret etched in Clara's face. After a long pause, Ella spoke, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I want to give this a chance, Clara. I want to believe that we can be family, but it's going to take time. And I need to feel like I can trust you again." Clara's eyes filled with gratitude, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you, Ella. That's more than I could have hoped for." They sat in silence, a tentative peace settling between them. Clara's face softened, and for the first time in weeks, Ella felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Ella returned to Clara's house, though with more caution than before. She attended her art classes with Ms. Bennett, pouring her emotions into her work with a renewed intensity. The art became a way to process her conflicting feelings, a blend of sorrow, anger, and a flicker of hope for something better. Clara gave her space, respecting her need for independence. Their conversations were careful, each word weighed, but slowly they began to rebuild the trust they'd lost. Clara introduced her to more art contacts, took her to exhibits, and encouraged her at every turn, but there was a new, quiet humility in her support. One day, Clara invited Ella to lunch with a few of her friends, women from the town who shared a passion for art and philanthropy. At first, Ella was nervous, feeling out of place among the elegantly dressed women who seemed to speak a language of privilege and sophistication. But Clara introduced her with pride, emphasizing Ella's talent and hard work. As they shared lunch in the garden, Ella began to feel a part of the conversation, drawn into a world she'd once only dreamed of. By the end of the meal, Clara's friends were charmed by Ella, admiring her talent and determination. One of them, Mrs. Hathaway, even offered to introduce her to a local gallery owner interested in displaying young artists' work. Later, as they walked back inside, Clara turned to Ella, her face beaming with pride. "I hope you enjoyed meeting them. I just wanted them to see how incredible you are." Ella gave a small smile, her heart warming. "Thank you, Clara. I didn't think I'd ever feel accepted in a place like this." Clara's eyes softened. "You belong here, Ella. I've always known that." The two continued to share their lives, one step at a time, rebuilding the shattered bond that had once brought them together. Though Ella's heart still held scars, she found herself embracing the small moments of joy and connection Clara offered. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara handed Ella a leather-bound journal. "I thought you might want a place to keep your sketches," she said softly, watching as Ella opened the journal to reveal blank, high-quality pages waiting to be filled. Ella ran her fingers over the pages, feeling the potential they held. She looked up at Clara, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Clara. This means a lot." Clara reached out, giving Ella's hand a gentle squeeze. "You've given me more than you know, Ella. I don't know what I would have done without you." Ella's heart swelled as she looked into Clara's eyes, seeing a love that went beyond guilt or obligation, a love that had grown, despite the darkness of their shared past. And though the wounds still lingered, Ella felt a glimmer of hope for the future, a hope that perhaps in time they could truly become the family she had always dreamed of. As she sat there, holding the journal in her hands, Ella knew that her journey with Clara was far from over. But for the first time, she felt ready to take that journey, to let go of the past and embrace the uncertain future ahead. In Clara, she had found not only a mentor, but a mother, flawed and imperfect, but real. And in that moment, as the fire crackled beside them, Ella felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The road to forgiveness was long, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time. A new beginning. Months passed, and as the seasons shifted, so did the bond between Ella and Clara. Their once tentative peace grew into something deeper, built upon understanding, respect, and an honest desire to move forward. Though Ella still carried the memories of betrayal, her time with Clara had softened those jagged edges. In their shared life, she'd begun to find a sense of home, one that felt more real and enduring than anything she'd known since losing her parents. Clara, too, had transformed. Her days of quiet regret and solitude had given way to purpose, her life filled with the joy of guiding Ella's artistic journey and watching her blossom into a confident young woman. In the evenings, they would sit together in the cozy library or in the art studio, each absorbed in their own work, but finding comfort in the other's presence. One afternoon, as they sat in the art studio, Ella was working on a new painting, a vibrant landscape inspired by the gardens surrounding Clara's home. She'd been experimenting with oils, something her tutor had encouraged, and though she still found it challenging, the results were worth the effort. Clara, seated nearby, watched in admiration, her eyes reflecting pride and joy. "You've truly come into your own, Ella," Clara said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I always knew you had a gift, but seeing it unfold like this, it's beautiful." Ella paused, looking over at Clara, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "Thank you, Clara. I couldn't have done it without you." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with love. "I'm honored to be a part of it." They shared a warm glance, each feeling the unspoken depth of their bond. A bond forged not only by shared joy, but also by forgiveness and resilience. But even as they grew closer, Ella knew she still had questions lingering in her heart, questions she had been hesitant to voice. Later that evening, after a quiet dinner, Ella and Clara retreated to the library. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room, and Ella felt a surge of courage as she looked at Clara, deciding that now was the time to confront her lingering uncertainties. "Clara," Ella began, her voice steady but hesitant, "there's something I've been meaning to ask you. I know you've apologized, and I've tried to put the past behind me. But I still don't fully understand why you chose to take me in. I know you feel guilt about what happened, but it feels like there's something more." Clara's gaze softened, and she set down her teacup, a faint smile touching her lips. "You're right, Ella. It's not just about guilt. The day you returned my ring, I saw something in you, a strength, a kindness, and a resilience that reminded me of myself, in a way." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "After my husband passed, I lost my sense of purpose. I became isolated, as though I'd faded into my own shadows. But meeting you, it reignited something in me, something I thought was gone. Ella listened, her heart swelling as she saw the vulnerability in Clara's face. When you showed up on my doorstep, I felt as though fate had given me a second chance, Clara continued, her voice thick with emotion. A chance not just to atone for my husband's mistakes, but to be a mother again, to build something real and lasting with you. Ella's eyes welled with tears, her heart aching as she listened. She realized that, in Clara, she had found not only a mentor but a mother who had chosen her, despite the painful past that linked them. I want you to know, Clara added, reaching for Ella's hand, that I would have loved you, supported you, even if that past didn't exist. Our connection, it was there from the beginning. Ella squeezed Clara's hand, her voice choked with emotion. Thank you, Clara. I know it hasn't been easy, and I still have moments where it hurts. But I'm grateful for you. You've given me so much more than a second chance. You've given me a future. In the months that followed, Ella continued her art studies, and Clara encouraged her to pursue every opportunity. Eventually, they decided that Ella would apply to the prestigious Morton Academy of Art, a school known for nurturing young talent. The application process was rigorous, requiring not only an extensive portfolio, but also personal essays, letters of recommendation, and a challenging interview. Ella spent weeks preparing, pouring herself into her work with a level of dedication that impressed even Ms. Bennett. She meticulously curated her portfolio, choosing pieces that reflected her journey, the pain of her past, the joy of her present, and the hope she held for her future. Clara was there every step of the way, offering guidance, encouragement, and support, reminding Ella that she was capable of achieving her dreams. When the day of the interview arrived, Ella felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. She stood outside the grand building of Morton Academy, her heart pounding as she looked up at the impressive facade. Clara had driven her to the school, offering a warm embrace and words of encouragement before watching her disappear inside. The interview was intense. The panel of professors questioned her about her artistic influences, her background, and her future aspirations. They studied her portfolio with critical eyes, offering both praise and constructive criticism. Ella answered their questions with honesty and passion, sharing her story not as a tragedy, but as the foundation of her art, a source of resilience and inspiration. When it was over, she emerged from the building, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated. Clara was waiting outside, her face lighting up as Ella approached. "How did it go?" Clara asked, her voice filled with anticipation. Ella smiled, a mixture of relief and pride in her eyes. "I think it went well. They asked a lot of questions, but I was honest. I told them about everything, my parents, my journey here, and how much this opportunity would mean to me." Clara hugged her tightly, whispering, "No matter what happens, Ella, I'm so proud of you." Ella felt a warmth fill her chest, and as she hugged Clara back, she realized that the outcome didn't matter as much as she'd thought. She had poured her heart into her work, shared her story, and embraced her journey. And whatever the result, she knew she had a family by her side, a home where she belonged. The acceptance letter arrived 2 weeks later, sealed in an elegant envelope bearing the Morton Academy crest. Clara watched as Ella opened it, her hands shaking with anticipation. The moment Ella's eyes scanned the words, "We are pleased to offer you a place at Morton Academy of Art," a stunned silence filled the room. I got in," Ella whispered, her voice barely able to contain her joy. "Clara, I got in." They embraced, laughter and tears mingling as they celebrated the beginning of Ella's new chapter. Clara's heart overflowed with pride, knowing that Ella's dreams were finally coming true. The pain of the past hadn't vanished, but it had softened, giving way to a brighter future. In the months that followed, life at Morton Academy challenged Ella in ways she hadn't anticipated. The coursework was demanding, and the level of talent around her was daunting. But Ella thrived, drawing upon her experiences, her struggles, and the resilience she'd developed to push herself further. Her art became her voice, each piece a reflection of the journey that had brought her to this place. Clara continued to support her, attending every exhibit, every showcase, her pride evident in every glance, every word of encouragement. Their relationship grew deeper with each passing day, and Ella found herself feeling not just gratitude, but a profound love for Clara, a love that had been tested, weathered, and ultimately strengthened by the truth they have confronted together. Years later, Ella stood in her first solo exhibition, a collection of paintings and sketches that told the story of her life. Each piece was a chapter, a memory of her parents, a tribute to her years at Street Mary's, a portrait of Clara, and a final piece titled Forgiveness, a hauntingly beautiful landscape that blended light and shadow, symbolizing the journey she'd taken to find peace. Clara stood beside her, her eyes filled with pride and emotion, as she took in the exhibit. The two of them were surrounded by guests and art lovers, each one admiring Ella's work, each piece drawing them deeper into the narrative of her life. When the crowd thinned, Clara turned to Ella, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't have the words to tell you how proud I am of you, Ella. You've created something extraordinary." Ella took Clara's hand, her heart full of gratitude and love. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me the chance to live my dream, to heal, to find myself." Clara smiled, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You've given me more than I could ever give you, Ella. You've given me family, forgiveness, and a chance to be the mother I always wanted to be." They embraced, the weight of the past finally lifted, their bond stronger than ever. In that moment, surrounded by the art that had become her life's story, Ella felt an overwhelming sense of peace. As they stepped back to admire the exhibit together, Clara spoke softly, her voice filled with emotion. "You know, Ella, I've always believed that family is something you choose, and I would choose you every day, no matter what." Ella smiled, her heart full. "I'd choose you too." And as they stood there, hand in hand, they knew that their journey, filled with pain, healing, love, and forgiveness, had shaped them both in ways they could never have imagined. They had found not just family, but a future built on resilience, trust, and the unwavering power of love.